In an earlier unit, we talked about modes. We got around to talking about three modes. The first mode was Ionian. Ionian is the same thing as the major scale. The next mode we talked about was Dorian. Dorian, we found, is the same thing as a major scale, but you lower the third and lower the seventh. That's the scale that works on a minor seventh chord. The other mode we talked about was Mixolydian. That's the mode that's built off the fifth and works for dominant seventh chords. Let's look at that one more time. So if we saw a C major seventh chord, we would use the Ionian mode, and that's the same thing as the major scale. Then we said if we see a C minor seventh chord, we're going to use Dorian. A couple of ways we thought about Dorian was it's the major scale with a lowered 3 and a lowered 7. And you could also think of it as a major scale starting on 2. For example, the B-flat major scale starting on C would be the C Dorian mode. And the last mode we talked about was for dominant chords. And we called that one Mixolydian. A couple of ways of thinking about that one. Major scale with a lowered seventh only. And another way was major scale starting on 5. So C Ionian, C Dorian, and C Mixolydian. What we had talked about was that it's always safe to use Ionian on a major seventh, and it's always safe to use Dorian on a minor seventh, and it's always safe to use Mixolydian on a dominant seventh. And that's true, those always are the safest choices, but they're not always the best. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of more modes that are actually better choices than what we might have in some of these instances. In order to understand these two new modes we're going to talk about today and how they're better choices sometimes, let's put that scale of sevenths back on the board. Remember what the scale of sevenths are. We're going to build a seventh chord from every scale degree of the C major scale. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Okay, C major seventh is our one chord, D minor seventh is our 2, E minor seventh is our 3, F major seventh is our 4, G7 is 5, A minor 7 is 6, and B half diminished is 7. So up till today what we had talked about was if you saw this major seventh and this major seventh, you'd use Ionian, the major scale. This minor seventh, this minor seventh, and this minor seventh, we'd use the Dorian mode. So major scale starting and ending on 2, or the major scale with a lowered 3 and a lowered 7. And if we saw that dominant chord, we're going to use Mixolydian. This last one, B half diminished, we haven't talked about yet. We'll get that a little bit later. Okay? Now let's think about this. Sure, it makes sense that in the key of C major, if you have a C major seventh chord, you're going to use the C major scale. And of course it makes sense that if we're having a chord that's functioning like a 2, that, for example, the D minor seventh in the key of C major, that we're going to use the second mode of major. So we're going to start that C major scale on a D. We're going to start that C major scale on D. And that's Dorian, and that makes sense, sure. And then when we get to that 5 chord, that G7, we're going to take that C major scale and start it on G. But can you see, using this concept of if it's a 2 chord, you use the second mode, and if it's a 5 chord, you use the 5th mode, it makes sense then. Let's look at a couple of more chords. Let's look at this scale right here, or this chord right here, F major 7th. If I'm in the key of C, and I have a chord progression, say, that goes back and forth between C major and F major, F major, C major, F major. I've got those two chords. It doesn't really make sense that I switch gears back and forth from a C major scale to an F major scale to a C major scale to an F major scale. It would be too much shifting of gears. C major scale, F major scale. Something sounds a little funny about that B flat that's popping in periodically on the F major scale. Sounds like it's really kind of out of place. Wouldn't it make more sense that if I've got those two chords, C major and F major, that I could just stay on the C major scale the whole time? Both of those chords are part of the key of C, so why not start the C major scale for the C major 7th chord, but also use the C major scale on the F major 7th, and that gets us to our next mode, which is called Lydian. So here's our C major scale. Okay, there it is. Here's the C major scale going up to B. Here we are at the octave right here. Can you see that we can also start that C major scale on F right there? And we get a new scale. If I've got a major 7th chord that's functioning like a 4 in the key, then I'm actually not going to use the major scale. I'm going to use this new mode, which is called Lydian. Lydian is the scale that we would use, or the mode we would use, for a major 7th that's functioning like a 4. Let's compare that. So the main thing is, you know that the Lydian scale is the major scale starting and ending on 4. Let's compare the Lydian mode to the major scale. If we had an F major scale here, we'd have one accidental, and then accidental we would write here. It would have been a B flat, but you can see how this B is raised to become a B natural. So another way of thinking about Lydian is that it's the major scale with a raised 4. That's one way to think about Lydian. Major scale with a raised 4. And the other way to think about Lydian is major scale starting on 4. Major scale starting on 4. If I want F Lydian, it's a major scale. F is the 4th scale degree of what? F is the 4th scale degree of C, so it's the C major scale starting on 4. If I want the D Lydian mode, I have to ask myself, D is 4 of what? D is 4 of A, so it would be the A major scale starting and ending on D. Let's try to build a couple of Lydian modes. So let's say, for example, I wanted to find the E flat Lydian mode. Okay, well there's two ways to do it. One, E flat Lydian, would be the E flat major scale with a raised 4. Well, the key signature of E flat is 3 flats, B flat, E flat, and A flat. I could just write up all those notes for the E flat major scale. And then I could just raise the 4th scale degree. 4th scale degree is right here, A flat, so raising it by a half step makes it an A natural. Okay, so that would be the E flat Lydian mode. That would be the scale that I would use if I had an E flat major 7th chord functioning like a 4. Like, for example, in the key of B flat. It was the 4th chord in the key of B flat. Let's try another one a different way. Let's try building an A Lydian mode. All right, well, let's think about it this way. Remember, Lydian is the 4th mode, so A is the 4th scale degree of what major scale? Well, A, if you go down 4, A, G, F, E, A is the 4th scale degree of E major. So if I put the key signature of E major here, and then started my scale on A, I would get the A Lydian mode. There we go. A Lydian. The E major scale starting and ending on A. Okay. So it has kind of a funny sound. It's got raised 4th scale degree. Some people are uncomfortable with that sound. It's something that takes a while for their ear to get used to. But when you really hear the difference between Lydian and Ionian, Lydian can be a little bit more of a modern sound. It can be a little bit hipper sound. It's kind of a nice sound to end a tune on. Let's say I'm in the key of C major. and I want a little bit more of a modern sound at the end, I can make it Lydian. Okay. Or if I've got a chord progression going back and forth between the 1 and 4, remember you can kind of think that one scale for both chords, C major to F major, just think the C major scale for both. In effect, you're playing the C Ionian mode on the C and the F Lydian mode on the F. The other place for Lydian mode is because of that raised 4, it's a really good scale to use if we have a major 7th chord with a raised 11th, but we'll talk more about 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths in a future lecture. So that's the Lydian mode. Let's look at example 2 here. You can see a little melody that's used on an F major chord if we were in the key of C. A little melody sounds something like this. How about that next melody, the one in E flat? This is what we would play on an E flat major 7th chord if it was a 4 chord in the key of B flat major. One more time. Okay. So the idea of Lydian is if a chord's functioning like a 4, you use Lydian. Well, let's look at another one here. Start fresh over. Let's go back to our scale of 7ths. Now, when we got to a minor 7th chord, we said that Dorian is always safe. But look at how many minor 7th chords we've got here in the scale of 7ths. We've got D minor 7th, E minor 7th, and A minor 7th. Well, the same concept holds true here. If I'm in the key of C and I see a D minor 7th, it makes sense that I'd use the 2nd mode, or Dorian. But if I'm in the key of C and I see an A minor 7th, then it makes sense that I would use the 6th mode of C major, not the 2nd mode. I wouldn't use a Dorian, I would use whatever the name of that mode is that's based on the 6th scale degree. So let's look at that. So here's our C major scale again. Okay, so there's a C major scale going beyond the octave. And let's look at what the scale would sound like if we started on the 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There it is right there. Starting on 6 and ending up here on G. There we go. So if I had an A minor 7th chord, I'd actually start that scale on A. Still a minor sound. In fact, this is kind of a familiar sound to most people. This is what most of us learn as our natural minor scale. But jazz musicians call this by its mode name, which is called the Aeolian mode. The Aeolian mode is the 6th mode. You can think of it a couple of different ways. A major scale starting and ending on 6. C major scale starting and ending on 6. We use it on an A minor 7th chord. Let's compare it to the major scale, though. Let's say we had an A major scale. How does this Aeolian mode differ from an A major scale? Well, the A major scale would have 3 sharps, C sharp, F sharp, and G sharp. So you can see that this Aeolian mode takes that 3rd scale degree and lowers it, takes the 6th scale degree and lowers it, and takes the 7th scale degree and lower it. So that's another way to think of Aeolian, a major scale with a lowered 3, 6, and 7. So those are the 2 modes. Let's listen to a little melody using Aeolian. Here in example 5, you'll see a chord E minor 7th, as if it was the 6th chord in the key of G. Sounds something like this. Has that interesting lowered 6th scale degree, different than Dorian. Okay. Example 6 goes for an F minor 7, as if we're a 6th chord in the key of A flat. One more time. One more time. Okay, that's the sound of Aeolian. Once again, just like with Dorian, Mixolydian, and Ionian, when you're building these scales and using them on chords, try to keep the chord tones on strong beats and keep the weak tones in between the beats, at least for a starting, how you would start using these modes. Later on, you'll find how to use the weaker tones on the beat to create tension, but for the time being, try to keep the chord tones on the strong beats. Let's look at example number 7. One more time. Okay, I kept chord tones on the strong beats. Has an interesting sound though. Listen to the F major Ionian, the Aeolian on D, Lydian on B flat, and mixed Lydian on the C. Okay, let's build a few modes. Exercise number 1 there asks you to build a few modes. Let's go ahead and do that. We've already built a few Lydians, so let's look at the Aeolians. We've got E Aeolian. E Aeolian. Okay, so let's do it a couple ways. Let's build an E major scale and then lower the 3, 6, and 7. So the E major scale would be 4 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. Okay, and lowering the 3rd, 6th, and 7. Well, the 3rd would be G sharp. It's in the key signature there, so we're going to lower that by a half step. 6 is C sharp, so we're going to lower that by a half step. And the 7th is D sharp, so we're going to lower that by a half step. And there, using the major scale as the basis, is your E Aeolian mode. Okay. That's one way to do it. Let's try it a different way on the next one. The next Aeolian mode that's asked for is G Aeolian. So let's do this one, figuring out what G is the mode of what major scale. Okay, G Aeolian is the 6th mode, so G Aeolian, G is the 6th mode of what major scale? We have to go down 6, don't go up 6. So G, F, E, D, C, B flat. Right? Why did I say B flat and not B? Well, think about the key of B major. B major would not have a G natural in it, it would have a G sharp. So you have to find the major scale that actually has G as its 6th scale degree, with G natural being that 6th scale degree. So we go down to B flat. So if I put the key signature here of B flat, that would be 2 flats, B flat and E flat. We're trying to find the G Aeolian mode. Now that I've got the key signature for B flat, I can just put the notes G up to F up there, and that gives us automatically our G Aeolian mode. Okay, there's G Aeolian. Okay, all right, let's try one more thing. I'll put a chord progression up here, and we'll determine what the best mode choices would be. Let's say we've got a chord progression that looks something like this. Here we go. Here's this chord progression. F minor, B flat 7, E flat major, A flat major, C minor. One more time. F major, B flat 7, E flat, A flat, C minor. Okay? So the first thing you need to do is, well, we go to the last time we talked about things. What's safe? Well, of course, anytime we have a minor 7th chord, it's safe to use Dorian. Dominant chords, it's always safe to use Mixolydian, and major, it's always safe to use Ionian. But now let's think about what's best. Maybe there's a better choice. Maybe there's an opportunity to use Aeolian and Lydian in here. Well, the first thing you need to do is figure out what key we're in. Well, looking through this, can you figure out what key we're in? A couple of hints about finding the key. Look for a dominant chord. Dominant chords only appear once in the scale of sevenths. So if you can find a dominant chord, it's likely you found the 5 of the key, especially if that dominant chord resolves down by fifths to something acting like a 1. Another thing you can look for is the 2-5 or the 2-5-1. Remember that pattern. A 2 is a minor chord, followed by a dominant chord for the 5, a fourth above, followed by a major chord, a fourth above that, for the 1. So quickly in this chord progression, hopefully you can start to spot the 2-5-1. It's happening right here. F minor to B flat 7 is our 2 and to our 5, and B flat 7 to E flat major is our 5 to 1. So there's a 2-5-1. When you've found a 2-5-1, you've at least temporarily found the tonal center, and that's where the 1 is. So if this chord is functioning like a 1, we're going to use Ionian on this chord. Now you can kind of work backwards and see that on the dominant, well, actually we don't have much choice on a dominant. We're pretty much going to use Mixolydian on a dominant chord. And the chord before that, now you can see it's part of this 2-5-1. So F minor is going to be the obvious choice here to use Dorian. Now let's continue on to that A flat. Well, is that a new 1? We have to kind of think, in the scale of sevenths, does an A flat major 7th chord appear in the scale of sevenths of E flat major? Well, it's either going to be a 1 chord or it's going to be a 4. Those are the only two places we've got those major 7th chords. So when you build a scale of sevenths in E flat major, F minor, G minor, A flat major, sure enough, there it appears. There's our 4 chord. So because this A flat major 7th is functioning like a 4, it's actually a better choice to use Lydian on that A flat major. There's nothing pointing here saying that we've modulated or shifted to the key of A flat. We're still basically in the key of E flat, so we're still going to be using the E flat major scale as the parent major scale through all of these modes. Let's look at the next one, C minor. Well, you're asking yourself the same question. Dorian is a possibility, but is Aeolian also a possibility? Does this chord, C minor, exist in the scale of sevenths of E flat major? Let's build them up. E flat major 7th, F minor 7th, G minor 7th is 3, A flat major we found is 4, B flat 7 is 5, C minor 7th, there it is as a 6th chord. So this C minor 7th actually currently is functioning like a 6, not acting like a 2 where we would use Dorian. So because this minor 7th chord is acting or functioning like a 6, that's why we would use Aeolian on this 6th chord here. So here's that chord progression again. And here's what those modes sound like. F Dorian, B flat Mixolydian, E flat major or Ionian, A flat Lydian, and C Aeolian. Okay, all right. So you're looking for opportunities to use Lydian and Aeolian. You're looking for where those major 7ths are functioning like 4s for Lydian, and a minor 7th is functioning like a 6 for Aeolian. Let's try one more of these before we finish today. One more chord progression. Let's see. Let's go to the key of G major now. Okay. Let's see what we've got. G major, E minor, C major, A minor, D7. Okay. Can you figure out what key we're in? Well, we've got a lot of different chords. Maybe we're in C. Maybe we're in E minor. We could be in a lot of things. Remember, the first thing you're looking for is a dominant chord or a 2-5 or a 2-5-1. Well, here's that dominant chord at the end, and right next to it is a 2-5. That 2-5, A minor to D7, sort of tells us in a way that we're in the key of G major. Does that make any sense? Well, we start on a G major 7th chord and we end with a 2-5. Highly likely that we're in the key of G major. So here we got a chord functioning like a 1 chord, and here we have 2 chords functioning like a 2 chord and a 5 chord. So it makes sense on this G major we would use Ionian. And it makes sense on these last two that we would use Dorian and Mixolydian. Okay. What about these chords in between? E minor, we used to use Dorian, but now can you see that in the scale of sevenths of G major, that E minor chord exists right there on the 6th scale degree? So that E minor chord actually is functioning like a 6, and we would choose to use Aeolian. And this C major 7th chord, are we going to jump straight to the C major scale? Well, the C major 7th chord exists in the key of G major also. It's a 4 chord. So remember, if you have a major 7th on 4, it's pretty much functioning like a 4 chord, and so we would use Lydian there. G major 7th, Ionian. E minor 7th, Aeolian. C major 7th, Lydian. Dorian on the 2. And Mixolydian on the 5. What really gets down to here is you can see that one major scale is going to work all the way through all of these chords. One more time. G major scale through all these chords. So you're thinking, well, why are you thinking all these different modes? Why are you thinking Ionian, Aeolian, Lydian? Why aren't you just improvising on the G major scale freely through all those chords? Well, in effect you are, but an important thing to remember is that the chord tones are your bass tones, which is 1, 3, 5, and 7, and 2, 4, and 6 of the mode are kind of like your passing tones. So if you think the mode, and just remember that the chord tones are your important tones and the other notes of the mode are your passing tones, it's easier to think and get more right notes in the right places. If you just want to think the G major scale through this entire progression, but just use each of the chord tones as your home tones and use the other tones kind of as your passing tones, that's another way to do it too. Many musicians feel it's important to know each separate mode that functions with each chord, and some jazz musicians just like to say, no, I'm just going to play freely through G major and I'll figure it out as I go. I don't need to worry about all that Lydian, Aeolian stuff. So there's a couple of different ways of thinking about all that. So this gets us to 5 of our modes. I want to change a couple of things before I let you go today, and that is, let's say that this chord was an E dominant 7th, and let's say that this chord was a C dominant 7th. Or maybe I'll even change it more. We're going to make that a minor 7th. Well, this changes things quite a bit here, because now this E7th chord is not a 6th chord in the key anymore. We've made this 6th chord into a dominant chord. And we only have one choice for dominant chords, and it is Mixolydian. We're not quite sure the Roman numeral function of this chord yet, but I know that when I see a dominant chord, I'm going to use Mixolydian. Now let's look at this one. This 4 chord, we changed it to a minor chord. Well, it's no longer appropriate to use a Lydian mode on a 4 chord when you've changed its quality. We made it into a minor chord, so now we have to use a scale that works on a minor chord. Is that chord functioning like a 2 in the key of G? Well, no, that would be an A minor. Is it functioning like a 6 in the key of G? No, that would be E minor. So what are we going to do with this minor chord that seems like a fish out of water? What are we going to do with that one? Generally what a jazz musician will do is, when in doubt, use Dorian. So if I see that C minor 7th chord, it's going to be temporarily acting like a pretend 2 chord, and we're going to just go straight to that Dorian scale on that one. So in effect, I'm going to use the B flat major scale on that chord and the A major scale on this one, getting kind of an interesting chord progression. G major to E Mixolydian to C Dorian, A Dorian to D Mixolydian. Okay, that's a couple of fun things to think about. Remember to keep the qualities. If it's a 6th chord, it has to be minor. If it's a 4 chord, it has to be major. Well, that's a good brief introduction on Lydian and Aeolian modes. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about a couple of new modes. You can see we've still got 2 chords left in our scale of 7s. There's plenty of other topics to talk about, so let's get on to the next one.